Linux Luddites, episode 68, for the 27th of December, 2015. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Jesse.
And I'm Paddy. And this time out, we're going to be taking a look back over the year to see what's happened and the best of the stories that we've reported on. Going to be looking at our predictions from last year and seeing how smug Joe can be this time around. And also making a little bit of an announcement about the show and how we're going to do things going forwards. So without further ado, play that twirly going back in time music and let's hit January 2015.
So first up then, all that time ago, LibreOffice for Android was supposedly coming soon. What happened to that then?
Well, it depends on what your definition of soon is, isn't it? I mean, if it's within the year, then technically they're correct.
Well, there's that kind of read-only version now, and there's LibreOffice as a service, which is available in OwnCloud, but there's not really a full feature version, is there?
No, I think it's somewhere that LibreOffice is definitely lacking. When they said it in January that it was coming, everyone sort of thought that was going to be the golden moment and have something to rival Google Docs, but it never quite came, and we're still waiting for the fully fledged version, really. Also in January, Samsung debuted its first Tizen phone, the Z1, and your trusty and erstwhile Luddites went the full mile and brought one from India. I mean, we reviewed it on the show, on show 42. And later that same year, this same year in fact, Samsung then announced in June that it had sold 1 million of the Tizen Z1s. So that's pretty good going from January to June to get to 1 million for a phone OS, which was up until then basically unseen by the public.
Yeah, and looking at the constant news releases, it still seems to be marching on quite nicely in certain parts of the world and doing very well indeed.
Why don't you remind us, Paddy, what didn't do quite so well in January?
Periodically throughout the year, we've reported on the odd crowdfunding. I don't know, fraud may be a little bit excessive a term, but for some of them it certainly isn't. I mean, the first one we spoke about was from a launch back in January, and we were talking about the Ubu tab Indiegogo. And this was a young lady in America who sort of failed on our actual Indiegogo campaign, but then started selling pre-orders for the product. And by June, it became apparent this really was a bit of a scam.
Yeah, this was that massive 1 terabyte sort of quite large tablet, wasn't it, if I remember rightly?
Yeah, and if I recall correctly, she'd sold various other Office products or tried to have crowdfunding campaigns for various other Office products as well. And it's actually a lass who works on a farm somewhere out in the Midwest, which is clearly a hotbed of technology innovation.
Oh, you never know. Don't be so cruel to the flyover states. Well, speaking of scams, is that fair? The Librem 15 reached its funding goal. And the whole promise of the Librem 15 and indeed the 13, which came in June, was that it would be totally free software top to bottom. And the bottom line is that just hasn't happened, has it?
Yeah, you guys had that really good interview with the chap who was working with Core Boot. What was his name again, Joe?
Ron Minnick.
Oh, that was it, yeah. And it was interesting that he seemed to be quite defensive about the Librem laptops and saying that they were doing all they could. But we had subsequent news stories in February and June, and more recently in December, there's been an announcement from the team about the use of CubeOS on the Librem 13. So, I don't know. Yes, I agree that there is significant doubt on where Librem is going, and I know Martin Wimpress has expressed sort of his views on it on this and other podcasts. And while there is this doubt, they clearly are quite good at publicity because everyone talks about them, and we've talked about them half a dozen times in a year. And I think it's getting to the point now where they either need to step up or step back, because I know people still haven't received the Librem 15. So it's on pretty thin ice as far as I can see.
Yeah, it looks as though every few months they're just putting out a different announcement and some new feature that's supposedly a good selling point for the box, but without ever addressing the basic fundamental issue, which is it was theoretically a very expensive laptop on the basis, well, a couple of laptops, on the basis that it would be completely free. And they've not delivered on that. They don't appear to be delivering on that. As you mentioned when we were talking to Ron, he did seem quite enthusiastic about them, but that was following a lunch, I think it was, he had with one of the founders. So they're obviously good salespeople, and whether it's just if you have personal contact with them, you end up believing them, whereas those of us standing back a little bit further perhaps just see the bigger picture, and it isn't a tale of success.
Oh, well, we'll see going forward. But you mentioned Martin Windpress there, and the first one from February is Ubuntu Mate gained official status for 15.04, which was going to be released a couple of months later, and that's all worked out, and now Ubuntu Mate is one of the official flavours.
And doing exceedingly well.
Unsurprisingly, really. I mean, we said it when we first reviewed 14.10, that it was just what Ubuntu should be. It's what it used to be when it was good, and you know, there's never that much to say about Ubuntu Mate because, as we always say, it's boring, but it stays out your way and does what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, it's the GNOME 2 days, and I don't think anyone has any bad memories, or maybe it's just because it has rose-tinted glasses that people look back on those days. But I do sort of wonder, given our most recent review where we talked about the welcome screen as one of the major features of the most recent Ubuntu Mate release, I wonder if that's, if that is where GNOME 2 would have gone, or whether this is started at GNOME 2 and everyone got on board, and now is obviously walking whatever path the Mate developers and Martin and his team want to take. I don't know. Do you think this is where the GNOME 2 would have ended up, or is this a different version than we would have had?
I think it's impossible to say, really, given what actually happened with GNOME 3. And maybe it would have just continued to be refined. I mean, it was very stable when they made the switch, and so there wasn't much more to do with it. And I think it's easy to conflate Ubuntu Mate with just Mate, because Mate itself hasn't really changed very much, has it? It's just bug fixes, refinements, slight new features here and there, but nothing major. And so I think that probably Mate itself wouldn't have been much different had GNOME stuck with it, with GNOME 2.
Yeah, I suppose that makes a fairly good point there about how Mate does stand on the shoulders of giants. They're starting from having a lot of things already working, already integrated, and yes, they had to update it to like GTK3 and things like this, but a lot of the base work was done. And you look at things like the SolarSOS project and Elementary OS, they're having to spend a lot of time getting the DE to work, whereas Mate had the benefit of I'm not saying they jumped up, because obviously the whole point was to fork GNOME 2 to keep that sort of known WIMP interface true, but it does mean that they were accelerated straight to the top, and basically, as far as I can see, you haven't really put a foot wrong since that point, and so have done really well this year.
Yeah, I was thinking back the other day to our original interview with Martin. We've spoken to him a couple of occasions now. And the thing that struck me, the slight disappointment I've got about the whole project, because from a desktop point of view, it's fantastic and we all like it. But listening back to what he'd said originally, he was planning on having a sort of open culture element to the whole project as well. And as well as just having a software delivery mechanism, there'd be a delivery mechanism there for other forms of media from an open culture perspective. And that hasn't seemed to have appeared on the scene. And I find that a little bit disappointing, to be honest.
Well, you never know. It might happen in 2016. But in April, Ubuntu Mate on hardware happened. The Entryware laptops, which we reviewed, and Entryware seemed to be going from strength to strength. They were the main sponsor at OggCamp and certainly got their name out there. So hopefully they're going to have a good 2016 as well.
Yeah, all credit to those guys over at Entryware. Unfortunately, in February of this year, Crunchbang came to an end, and there's been quite a number of sort of pop-ups to try and replace it, some with the full backing and others with less backing, but there's been Crunchbang++, and we recently reviewed Bunsen Labs, so there are alternatives for those who want the Debian base with the OpenBox window manager.
And it was also in February that the funding issue for open source projects got a lot of focus, as a realisation suddenly dawned on people that these guys writing very important code in their attics that everybody else ran really ought to get a little bit of money for their efforts and the maintenance of that code. So we had OpenNTP receiving some funds, the GNU Privacy Guard project getting some, and this kind of led on during May to OpenSSL, OpenSSH, also getting funding from the Linux Foundation, who set up an initiative called the Core Infrastructure Initiative that's been doling out grants ever since.
Yeah, that same initiative even went on in August to donate money to the OpenBSD project, recognising that things like OpenSSH are being funded from there. So you get the benefit of shared code between the ecosystems of BSD and Linux.
You have to remember what the environment was like back in February this year, because it was in the previous year, in 2014, we had things like shell shock going on. I was quite surprised, actually, when I looked back through the show notes that it wasn't this year, because it seems very fresh in my mind still.
Yeah, and Heartbleed was 2014 as well, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. So a lot of the infrastructure that we took for granted and had been taken for granted for many years was definitely creaking around the seams, and there was a need for cash there to keep some of these projects going.
Well, sticking on the discussion of security and things, we have the issue with Lenovo has cropped up a number of times this year, and they were shipping PCs with man-in-the-middle adware that broke the HTTPS connections, and so this was given the nickname the Superfish, and it was within software that Lenovo were shipping as part of the PC and was running and doing this man-in-the-middle attack, and they got caught. And so later on, it was actually revealed that despite all of the, there's all these news stories and the reputational damage they had and the bad face and having to go back and remove it and promise never to do it again, for this whole furore, they only got $250,000, which, given the size of Lenovo, their PC manufacturing, the laptops, the phones and tablets now, it really is a drop in the ocean compared to the bad press they got for the whole shebang.
I wonder if it's made any difference to other OEMs. I don't suppose so. I don't suppose we're going to get to a situation where you can buy a laptop with just straight Windows with no bloatware on it, because there'd be no money in it. So I would imagine nothing will change as a result of it.
I don't think anything has changed, to be honest. I mean, there's been some stories over the last month or two, which we've not covered on the show, which are very similar to this, about invasive pre-installed software. And I mean, it's got to such a state now that I noticed that Microsoft are going to take over responsibility, if you like, for this sort of thing and actually prevent the likes of Superfish ever happening again on Windows. And any form of ad injection is going to have to be authorized via the browser itself. You won't be able to do it externally to the browser. So it's caused some change in the industry, but not a huge amount, I don't think.
Well, thank goodness for Linux, eh? And Jesse's darling for this year that really worked out well, we'll get back to that, was Elementary OS. And it caused a bit of a stink in February about trying to get people to pay to download it.
The thing is I never really understood where the backlash was, because it said like $5, $10, $20 other. And I went to go and download it once it got released, and before this whole thing kicked off, I must have been fairly early on, and I clicked on other and pressed 0 and pressed download, and I got it for $0. And I didn't at any point think, what is odd about this? I just thought, these guys are trying to get paid. And of course you put hurdles in the way to try and push people to pay, but you don't need like more than 3 brain cells to work out that if there's an option of other, there's an option of 0, and therefore you can pay what you like. And I'm amazed that everyone got so up in arms for these people trying to make money out of what they're doing. And everyone agrees that there are ways of making money out of open source software. And one way is to say, will you donate to me? And I don't understand where the backlash came from, but it was fairly big, and they got some nasty words on the internet.
As far as I remember, it was because of some blog post or something that one of the Elementary guys put up, basically accusing anyone of downloading it for free of freeloading, or some fairly harsh term like that, wasn't there originally?
It was cheating, I think.
Yeah, there's a Reddit thread claiming that's what was said in the post, but looking at the post now and a Control F for cheater, there's nothing there, so they've gone back and edited it, 1984 style maybe. But yeah, I think that was the crux of it there. It was that comment that you're cheating if you don't pay for it, rather than gentle encouragement. It was a case of trying to guilt trip people, I think. And yeah, that's where they went wrong there.
It's still an ongoing issue, though, isn't it, for projects? I mean, we've spoken about the Core Infrastructure Initiative ponying up funds for some of the larger key components of the basic server infrastructure. But for a lot of smaller peripheral projects, it is either asking the users to pay or having advertising in one way or another. And it is an unsolved problem still, and it's one we've talked about many times on the show.
And so we move on to March, and first off, we had a GPL enforcement lawsuit against VMware, and I have to admit my memories failed a bit on this one. Has either of you two got this one in your heads?
Yeah, the allegation in this case was that VMware created a new product by combining their own code, which was the VM kernel module, with portions of Linux's code, which obviously is potentially an issue if you believe that such combined things actually violate GPL v2, which the kernel is licensed under.
And by November, that had something of a knock-on effect for Conservancy because the Linux Foundation stopped supporting them. And so they, well, you've put in the notes begging for cash. That's a little bit harsh. They certainly have put out a request for donations to cover the shortfall.
Yeah, and the shortfall was partially caused, at least, although no one seems to have ever confirmed this, by the fact that the Linux Foundation was a funder of Conservancy at one stage and then suddenly weren't. And I've never seen any confirmation that that's what happened, but if you just look at the archive.org copies of the pages for Conservancy's funding, that appears to be what happened.
Well, there's nothing more interesting than software copyright law. So let's move on, shall we? And again in March, the BBC gives children mini computers in the Make It Digital scheme. Well, they said they were going to, the microbit, but that still hasn't happened, has it?
It hasn't, and in September we reported on one of the reasons why it's not. They had a problem with power supplies for these devices. We're talking about the microbit. Now, we've also spoken since then about other devices like the chip or the Pi Zero, which we're going to come on to later on in this show. So this microbit thing, it may run Python these days, but it's looking a little bit not quite as shiny as it did at the time, is it?
No, it's a classic case of announcing things before they're actually ready, and you have a few delays, and then suddenly it seems a bit obsolete. Well, you can't be a bit obsolete, can you? It's a binary situation. But it certainly seems old hat compared to the Raspberry Pi Zero, which I know you panned it a little bit, Paddy, because you've got to have all sorts of connectors for it, and because it's not very powerful, but it's an awful lot more powerful than the microbit. And price-wise, I can't see it being hugely different.
I would stick on Paddy's side of the fence for this. I think because the microbit has things like you can put buttons on it and you can, have Bluetooth on it and other bits and bobs without having to add all these extra things. The idea is that you could use it to communicate with your friend on the bus and bits and bobs. So I think it has a lot more built in, ready to go than the Pi Zero, which is where the Pi Zero, you could say, lacks or has the benefit of not having all of these extra things, tacked onto it, which makes it so cheap and so small.
Try running a Samba server on it then. Or something like that. Certainly for us, it's much more interesting, the Pi Zero, than the microbit. But I suppose from an educational point of view, you're probably right.
I'm just going to keep that sound clip to myself. So we move on to the last news story that we're going to reflect on from March, and that is that the Linux kernel adopted a conflict resolution code so that where maybe things got heated or someone had a disagreement, there would be a course of action in order to cool that situation down.
And that, of course, ties into the stuff that happened in October with Sarah Sharp and Matthew Garrett leaving the project and all of the hate mail that followed suit when we spoke about it.
Yeah, which we continue to get on a variety of occasions, don't we?
Indeed.
But no, I mean, it's good to have these sort of debates out in the open, no matter where you stand on them. And I think from that perspective, Eric Raymond's contribution was really valuable, to be honest, because like him or loathe him, and plenty of people do loathe him out there, he's a respected figure in the industry. Well, even if you don't respect him, he's a voice that people listen to. So for him to pitch in on the topic, I think really helped shine a light on the topic.
The whole thing seems to be quite a hot topic, in not just in the FOSS world, but in the wider kind of normal people world. I mean, even pretty much a whole series of South Park was recently devoted to the whole social justice warrior, if you want to call it that, issue. And the question of whether people are taking the idea of equality too far and pushing it to the point where you haven't really got equality anymore because you've got positive discrimination and stuff. So it's a very hot topic that a lot of people have tried to avoid. And when I've given any sort of feelings on it, there has been a backlash. And I think that people are afraid to speak about this and will continue to do so going into next year, which is a bit of a shame, really.
So it's no secret to long-term listeners of the show that I work in engineering, and we have a very similar sort of issue with the number of women in engineering. And I'm taking that one particular demographic as an example because it's the one that stands out when you walk around my office. There are sort of not real strong practices, but there are procedures and there are thoughts in place as to trying to make it as easy is the wrong word, but remove as many hurdles as possible to ensure that it is as smooth as possible for women to have the same access to the opportunities at work as men do. But if it's a fine line, because if my corporation was to move into positive discrimination, to say we will have, well, let's say 50%, 50%, the women who are being employed would know they've been employed because they're a woman, not because they're being employed for their skills and their talent, which currently is why we're employing women, because you put the gender, you put the race, the religion to one side, and you look at experience and knowledge and aptitude tests and things like this. And it just so happens that the number of women applying is that way round. And so you're right, it does become this sort of odd grapple between trying to show equality by having 50-50, but not pushing it so that you're actually bringing people into the company on false pretenses just because they're a woman, and no one will benefit from that at all.
Yeah, and there's a huge difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. And I thought one of the things I found interesting in how the debate's moved on this year is the post by Matthew Garrett, which really was pitching at equality of opportunity as opposed to outcome, trying to sell it from that point of view, whereas a lot of this activity in the past has been at equality of outcome. I mean, it's exactly the same thing in Parliament, where we're forever having people saying we ought to have an equal number of MPs because women make up 50% of the population, therefore there ought to be 50% MPs are women, which seems a logically sort of argument. But as you suggest, Jesse, in different trades and industries, it's quite obvious that people seem to be attracted to them on the basis of things like gender. It's not just purely the educational system. In fact, education is a good example. There is a huge preponderance of female teachers out there in primary and junior schools as opposed to males, and that changes a little bit when you get into secondary education where there's a lot of males. So different trades, different industries do attract different people. I don't know. I mean, it's a debate that's going to continue, but I think we can all agree, as long as people aren't being discriminated against irrationally, I think that's absolutely fine. I don't see why we shouldn't be discriminating on the basis of people's talents and abilities and what they can actually bring to certain posts.
Yeah, I must say I agree with you, Paddy, that it is okay to discriminate against people based on skills and talent and whether they're right for whatever it is that they're doing. You wouldn't have someone who had no editing experience, like one of you two, edit this show. So I'm discriminating against you two and forcing myself to do it. You know, I could train one of you maybe. That's a good idea. Maybe I should do that. But, you know, that's just the first thing that popped into my head. But yeah, if someone is right for the job or the role and someone is wrong for it, then whether or not they are white or black or gay or straight or male or female has got nothing to do with it, or should have nothing to do with it. It should be a meritocracy. And that is the debate that I have seen with the kernel, whether or not that is a true meritocracy, because the idea of, if you've got a certain group of people, their standards of what is with merit and what is without merit is reinforced. And if you don't have a diverse group of people come in and change that idea of what is worthy and what is not. But I think that is a very weak argument personally. But I'm sure that there are many people listening who would probably disagree with me.
One of those people is me. And I know we need to move on to April, but I just wanted to point out that in my description of the way that we try and incorporate and allow as many women into the engineering profession, we try and remove the hurdles. And some of those hurdles within the kernel mailing list, I think, are the reason that Sarah Sharp left. So things like, jarring personal insults may well bounce off someone and may well bounce off the majority of men, but might be taken more personally by women. And so while meritocracy is one thing, unless you have a playing field on which, both genders, all races, all religions can play equal to all their own terms, it will become difficult. And I think that's maybe where this becomes a little bit more complicated than just saying it should be based on how skillful they are. It has to be based on how skillful they are, assuming that all other things are equal. And if there are, homosexual or heterosexual or sort of playground bullying and things, then you're not on a level playing field.
It sounds to me that you've just said there that men can take a bit of banter, but poor little women, they can't, which is not my experience at all, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and we will then quickly go into women on the front line and doing the same things as men, and it becomes a whole subgenre. So shall we crack on to April?
Go on then. And April was the month that saw an awful lot of Ubuntu tablets hit the street. And we reported on it at the time, and I haven't seen anything else about this later in the year. Haven't you guys ever seen an Ubuntu tablet?
I have never seen an Ubuntu tablet that isn't a Nexus 7 that's been flashed with it by the owner. I've been mixing in circles where you'd expect to see one, so that doesn't seem to have panned out very well.
Perhaps they all sat in a cupboard somewhere with all those Ubuntu TVs.
Maybe.
And it was also the month that there was general European availability for the BQ Aquarius, which first made an appearance on the scene back in February, and you got your hands on one back in February, didn't you, Joe?
Yeah, I got to have a hands-on in the pub with it and wasn't very impressed, I'm afraid. Hardware-wise, it was all right, but the software, given that it wasn't just a hack, a custom ROM effectively for a Nexus 4 that I'd tried, and we tried it on the Nexus 7, but actually on the phone, it didn't perform any better, which I was a bit surprised about at the time, or was I? Probably not, to be honest. And yeah, it just wasn't very good, really.
When we were at the sort of open hardware summit, I had a look at that same phone, and you're right, I know what you're saying about the software. You didn't feel like it was at one with the hardware, but I did like the hardware, despite the fact that it had a fairly sluggish processor and not enough RAM for sort of, high-end modern-day phones, but even sort of middle-of-the-road phones, it was definitely in the bottom of the pile. But the actual physical hardware, the device, the feel in the hand, the size of it, the look, was really, really smart. So I've actually looked on eBay to see if I can get one cheap, but they're not as cheap as just throw away money to play with. So still out of reach, and I believe now entirely out of reach because they're not selling them anymore. If I remember on more recent news stories.
No, that was the MX4, which leads us on to May quite nicely. The Meizu MX4 was released, at least the Ubuntu version of it, which was a much more powerful phone and pretty much up there with the flagships. Now, I've never actually got my hands on one of these. I've seen them in various pub situations, so I don't know how it performs relative to the BQ phone. So you never know. It might be amazing.
You mean it might have had been amazing?
It might have had been, yes. Now that it is no longer available, because in October, Meizumart, which was the website that was selling it, was closed and it disappeared. Now, I asked Popey about this specifically, and he said Meizu make phones for a certain amount of time and then they become obsolete and they start making a new one. And so they weren't going to keep the factory run going for an old phone just because it has Ubuntu on it. So they just, as part of their manufacturing cycle, stopped making them with the intention of hopefully maybe another Ubuntu phone at some stage. Because let's not forget that both of these Ubuntu phones are Android phones that have had Ubuntu flashed on them and weren't custom made specifically to have Ubuntu on it in the first place. So we're still not seeing, although I'm not sure about the other BQ phone. I think that was an Android phone as well. So we've not seen a proper Ubuntu phone yet, as far as I'm concerned. Certainly not a bespoke, custom-made one.
Yeah, and having spoken to Popey, I get the impression that there are other manufacturers in the wings, or at least he gave that impression for 2016. So we'll see what that prediction. No, that's not going to predictions. So we move on to Mozilla, who had an overhaul of their Firefox smartphone OS, and they decided to focus on quality and not the low cost that they had initially sort of aimed at. So when Firefox OS came out, it was going to be for the developing market. It was going to be for very cheap phones, i.e. low-end phones, and therefore the whole operating system had to be very nimble, and it was all, as minimal as it could be and very web app orientated. So they then, in sort of May of this year, shifted that a little bit to say, no, we're going to focus on quality and the user experience, i.e. stepping away a little bit from the complete low-end market, which they were trying to get into India and China and the sort of BRIC countries.
So was this when they came out with the idea of this see-through phone that both of you quite like the look of?
Yeah, I was desperate for one of those phones that looked very smart.
Well, it worked out really well for them, didn't it? Or maybe not, because in December, recently, I think one of the last shows, we reported that they're going to stop developing and selling at least Firefox OS phones. So it's all a bit of a sorry, sad tale, unfortunately.
It is, and I'm still waiting for that phone call to appoint me CEO. Anyway, whilst I'm waiting, I shall tell you all about Oculus Rift. And back in May this year, they suspended development for Linux to focus on Windows only. And this was kind of a shock for people who had supported their crowdfunding efforts and got an Oculus Rift on the basis of the fact that Linux would be supported.
Yeah, this is back on the crowdfunding issues and what you sign up for and what maybe in your head you're getting. Because I think it was a stretch goal and they hit it, and they were going to be developing the Oculus Rift with Linux support. But that was only for the first piece of hardware and the first bit of software. And it was very much the one that we ship on day one. And as day 2, 3, 4, year one, whatever came to be, they realized they had to really focus on what they were going to do and try and perfect one thing rather than all. And they had their money. So, and by this point, were they sponsored by Facebook as well? In which case they had all the money, but they just wanted to make sure that it worked on one thing. And the fact that it was going to work on Linux and did doesn't mean that it will work forever, because that's not what the crowdfunding campaigns mean.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on from a factual point of view. It's people's expectations were somewhat different is the issue here, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And you would optimistically hope that if you signed up to something that ran on Linux, it would run on Linux forever, and no one would have kicked up a fuss if it had, obviously. But clearly they needed whatever it was, focus or to not be distracted. Maybe their team was not big enough. They just had to focus on Windows and get it right on one. I
think at some stage we're going to have to do an over a pint on virtual reality, because apart from a few niche applications that I can actually understand a valid use case for it, it does seem like a complete load of hokum.
I absolutely agree. And what Microsoft is doing and the difference between that. So, okay, let's save that for an over a pint. Also in May, Kubuntu and Ubuntu had a bit of a head-to-head, and this is when Jonathan Riddle was trying to push Ubuntu to release some information, and also was disagreeing with the way in which they'd been dealing with him. And Joe knows more because he had a full-on interview with him on Show 43.
Yeah, I can't believe it was all that time ago in May, that beautiful evening when I had to go out and use all sorts of lashed up technology, a tablet, a phone, a hardware recorder. But yeah, I interviewed Jonathan, and it was very interesting to hear his side of the story, because I hadn't heard it from the horse's mouth, as they say, anywhere else. No one seemed to want to interview him, because I asked him and he said, yeah, no problem. So it was a bit strange, really. But the crux of it was he had two issues with Canonical and the Ubuntu Community Council. The first of them being the donations, where if you go to download Ubuntu, I think still now, it asks you for donations. And one of the things you can specify is that it's for the flavors. And he had said that none of the money had actually gone to Ubuntu. So that was one issue he had. The other was their intellectual property policy, and whether or not you need to recompile the code, or whether you can redistribute binaries, and how that fits in with the GPL. And both issues I haven't really seen a satisfactory conclusion to. But as a result of him kicking up a stink about those, and perhaps the way in which he did that, the Ubuntu Community Council asked him to step down, and he said no. And then there was a big snafu, and then it all went a bit quiet and a bit private, and it was all private emails and stuff rather than IRC and public mailing lists. And then in October, he actually stepped down. So I would very much like to catch up with him again to see exactly what happened in October, why it finally happened. I can only assume that it was they got the release out, the 15.10 release, and then he stepped down.
Yeah, that was my understanding as well. And as you suggested, I haven't seen satisfactory answers to the questions. I mean, on the intellectual property front, Matthew Garrett's still banging that drum, and we've reported on that on the show. And I think it was acknowledged at the end of the day that funds had vanished, or for a period of time at least, that was supposedly for the flavours, and no one knows where it went. But how that was apportioned out at the end of the day, again, is kind of a mystery.
And then rounding off the news in May, Mandriva finally shut its doors, and there was the sort of background to this was that the CEO was saying that a number of lawsuits from previous employees meant that it actually got put out of business. And Mandriva had been, if not bankrupt, but certainly sort of liquidated and moved and rebought, and had many people administering it. And unfortunately, it got to a point where it was no more. And I think there was quite a big outcry from the general community, because a lot of people had either started on Mandriva or had very fond memories of it. And so it unfortunately closed its doors in May this year.
Well, I said it at the time, damn you, French socialism.
Yeah, employment law's a bugger, isn't it?
Yep.
Well, moving on to June then, and the Linux Foundation, who our reporting on got, I think, a little harsher as we progressed through the year, and we drew people's attentions to some of the slightly dubious behaviour going on there. Apart from the good activities, like giving money away to projects that needed it, they welcomed with open arms Allwinner. And, of course, Allwinner have a big reputation, a huge reputation as being GPL violators.
Yeah, I remember thinking at the time that the Linux Foundation will pretty much take money from anyone, really, and that seems to be proof of it. Although I seem to recall Allwinner promising to clean up their act going forward, but I suspect those words were rather hollow.
Also in June, SourceForge, how do we put this more politely, made some decisions that most people in the open source software didn't entirely agree with. This was that rather than just hosting the code and the binaries, they were actually injecting into them various bits of malware that then obviously released themselves on people's computers when they installed it. And so it was basically the nail in the coffin from the open source community for a sort of a repository or a host for these projects.
I think that malware is a bit of a strong term there, perhaps too strong. It was more adware, which, okay, maybe that's the same thing. But what we're talking about is Windows binaries of things like GIMP were changed for installers that also bundled adware with them. So you could untick them and stuff in the installer, but if you just do a next, like most people do on Windows, you ended up with toolbars and things like that. But either way, it left a very bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. The fact that SourceForge had taken over people's projects basically on there. But it didn't really affect us Linux users, but it was still just, as you say, it's almost a nail in the coffin. A lot of people have subsequently moved away from SourceForge, and it feels like they're never going to be booming again. I don't suppose they'll die because they've got enough money to continue, but I don't suppose many new open source projects are going to be hosting there anytime soon.
Yeah, again, the question of monetization rears its ugly head. And it was also in June that we reported on the Russian government blocking access to the Wayback Machine. And at the time, it consisted of 485 billion web pages, and they were being blocked because there was some Islamic terrorist information actually had been archived there from one particular site, if I remember correctly. And because it was all proper, nice SSL, TLS, HTTPS guffage, there was no way of discriminating which page you were going to. So the simple answer the Russian government thought was just pull the plug on the whole lot.
This is one of those cases where you actually see some of the downsides of HTTPS being ubiquitous. And I know that that's not a popular view to say anything negative about HTTPS, but if you end up with 485 billion pages blocked because they only really want to block one, then it is quite serious.
Isn't June the month that you bought your super small, super clever little projector, Joe?
It is indeed, and I'm still using it now. I've been using it to watch films and actually as a test machine as well, because my test VIO has got an ATI graphics card in it, so it doesn't like freedom-loving distros, whereas the Gigabyte Bricks projector that I've got is actually fairly free software friendly. The only thing that doesn't work is the Wi-Fi card, but the Ethernet works, so it's not a huge issue that I can use that. So I'm very happy with it. Having said that, watching some films recently, I've thought it could do with higher resolution because it's very low resolution. I think it's sort of 600 by something, so it's not even 720p. But generally speaking, for the price that I paid for it, I think just over 200 quid to have an i3 machine that is a reasonable desktop computer and also a Pico projector that I can push up to about 90 inches, having rearranged my flat in order to do that.
That is a worthwhile rearrangement.
Yeah, very much so. I had to move speakers around and stuff. It was amazing. I was watching The Wolf of Wall Street the other night and thinking, yeah, this is really nice. Hooked up to my studio monitors and proper cinematic experience. So highly recommended. The price seems to fluctuate a bit, but yeah, it's one of the things that I always wanted to buy, a projector. So maybe when I get more money, I'll buy a more high resolution one. But for now, it's doing pretty well.
So we move on to the second half of 2015 and cracking on, as we so often do, with July. And in this month, Jolla cut the hardware business loose so that they could concentrate solely on Sailfish OS and the licensing of that. And up until now, I believe they had the phone out and they were yet to release the Kickstarter tablet.
And that has worked out brilliantly, much like Firefox OS. Oh, wait, no, it hasn't. We were talking about in November, they were on the verge of bankruptcy. And I think it surprised everyone to hear this month in December that they had managed to get some funding for December and actually keep going. So the staff that they laid off in November presumably were rehired, and they are progressing towards delivering these tablets. But I think that when it gets to that kind of level where you're so desperate for funding that one round can kill your company, it doesn't look good, does it? I mean, it feels like a stay of execution to me.
Yeah, I tend to go along with you. I mean, they haven't actually hired back everybody that was laid off. I mean, some folks have gone back. Some they're having difficulty with because they'd already given them payoffs and weren't in a position then contractually to take them back. And they haven't actually committed to delivering on the tablet yet. They're apparently going to make an announcement on that in January. So it's still very unclear what the long-term situation is.
But I think this is good news. Obviously, having Yola and mostly having Sailfish being worked on, because at the end of this year, it looked like Firefox OS and Sailfish were going down the pan. And when you take those out, you don't end up with many more sort of Linux phone OSs that you're really backing. Android is the big one and the dominant one, but has its inherent issues. You've got Ubuntu Phone, which I think 2016 is going to be a big year for if they actually get convergence working. And you've got Tizen, which is not as sort of welcoming or inviting, given the fact that it's basically being developed by Samsung. So to have Firefox and Sailfish, while we didn't give them the world's greatest reviews, it was good to have them in the running. And so I think it's, while Sailfish is clinging on, it's nice to have that extra person in there.
Speaking of Ubuntu Phone, Plasma Mobile was launched, and this was so annoying to me because unlike all of the other Linux-based mobile OSs that are available for the Nexus 4, this is only available for the Nexus 5, which I sold and have basically regretted ever since because it was such a great phone. So I actually even looked around for a cheap Nexus 5 with a smash screen or, some way to get it cheap, and it just didn't happen. So I still haven't seen this in action. They've got a beautiful website. We've got a slick video showing it off, but I can't really comment further than that because I've never had my hands on it. But that said, this was July and I haven't heard much in the way of development since. I don't know if that's because I haven't been specifically looking because I haven't got a Nexus 5, but it seems to be a bit quiet to me.
I was going to say, it's probably because you're not a regular peruser of the KDE mailing lists, are you?
Probably you are, Paddy, among the myriad other mailing lists.
Yeah, I must admit, I've not heard much more about this either because it was quite a big splash at the time.
Well, other than covering it on the news, I don't think I looked at it, and if I did, it left no impression. So I can't think of any device I would have put it on. I think we'll wait for an update from the Plasma Mobile people and see if we can maybe give it a review in 2016 if we see it. But moving from July on to August, and the big sort of tech news rather than Linux news was the rearrangement of Google and the birth of Alphabet as the sort of head company, and then Google Search being a subdivision of that, and various other subdivisions that basically no one's heard anything more about because Google does everything. So this is the big tech shake-up and took everyone by surprise as far as I can see. No one really saw it coming. And I don't think there's been a huge change in the way that Google works. People still know that Nexus has come out and there's Google Search and Android is doing its thing. It's just been sort of a management move around as far as I can see.
Well, I'm sure the accountants have been very, very busy hiding their wealth in the various companies. That's what we said at the time, that it was pretty much a tax dodge, wasn't it?
It was, and since we've not really seen any other noticeable change, as Jesse just said, yeah, it seems a reasonable proposition still. And August also was the month that stage fright hit the scene and Android security got put underneath the microscope, and there was a realisation that things just couldn't carry on the same way as they were being done previously. Much as earlier in the year, back in February, there was realisation that funds need to be pumped into a lot of the basic server applications. And a lot of vendors came together and said, we're going to start putting out monthly updates. HTC was one notable exception, and in October they actually said that it's totally unrealistic to do that, to commit to that going forward. But some of the other manufacturers seem to have been keeping up with that schedule.
Well, my mum has got a Nexus 7, and yesterday I updated that to 6.0.1, and now it says December for the security status on that, the security level. And my wife's Nexus 4, which is totally stock, that's been getting regular updates. So certainly on the Nexus side of things, but didn't Samsung say that they were going to do it? And I don't know whether that has come to pass because I haven't got any Samsung devices.
No, I was hoping that our Samsung guru could tell us.
Am I the Samsung guru?
Well, you had a Samsung phone, even though you haven't run stock Samsung firmware on it for how long now? Years.
Yeah, so I've had my newer phone for just over a year now, my Motorola. And before that, I didn't have Samsung on my phone for definitely a year, if not more. So it's been a while. And I would give you an update after Christmas because both parents have Samsung phones, so I can check those. But other than that, I get the impression that like you said, the various carriers or the manufacturers being fairly good at getting the monthly updates from Android through. And while they may not be pushing things like the full Android update to Marshmallow, they are at least making sure that the security updates and the fixes get pushed through. So, I mean, as I say, I haven't seen it on phones, but that's the impression that I got.
Well, my brother a couple of days ago went to Argos and bought himself a £70 tablet, 10-inch tablet. So you can imagine how good that was. And that was coming with 5.0 Lollipop with no doubt big security holes in it. So this problem has not gone away. There are still a lot of lower end devices running ancient versions of Android with no security patches. And it's just a terrible, terrible situation. It's all right for us Nexus users and people who can flash custom ROMs with the latest fixes in them. But the vast majority of the billion Android devices out there, forget about it. They're probably never going to see these patches.
Yeah, and I'm keeping very quiet because I think my phone's still on 4.1. Anyway, August was also a month in which the fury of the open source community was directed towards Oracle, because the lady in question had made some pretty strong comments on a blog post, which I must admit I agreed with at the time, and I still do, although various other people certainly didn't, suggesting that people informing Oracle about their security problems wasn't particularly welcome if it involved disassembling code and doing reverse engineering.
Yeah, this was Mary Ann Davidson, and I think I ultimately agreed with you, Paddy. If their license, which you agree to, says that you're not allowed to do something with that code, whatever it may be, then you have two choices. Either don't have anything to do with it or abide by the rules of that license. And if that doesn't chime with open source standards and ways of doing things, well, it's not open source software, it's proprietary. What do you expect? Just don't use it if you've got a problem with it. So, again, not a very popular opinion, but just logical, I'm afraid.
Yep, and rounding off the August news was more proprietary discussions on Windows 10 updates and the fact that they were updating in the background or downloading the data ready to update, but were doing it in the background so that when the user clicked on the install button, it happened very quickly. But the problem is because it was doing it in the background, it was very much going through people's data caps, because apparently people have broadband data caps. Is that a thing?
It is in other countries, yeah.
Yeah, and there's also a decreasing use of broadband. I mean, I was looking at the stats for America the other day and saw that broadband adoption in the States is actually going down because more and more people are using just wireless.
Where it's very common to have caps of 1 and 2 and 3 gigabytes. So that could chew through that very, very quickly indeed. And it's funny that whenever we cover any Windows news, it tends to be bad news, like the stuff with Lenovo, and now with Windows 10 and the terrible privacy implications of installing that, certainly if you go with the defaults. And it just makes me so grateful for desktop Linux, and just makes me realize that how can anybody use Windows on a daily basis? I mean, I can see certain uses for it here and there, and I always advise people to keep a Windows partition and dual boot, but I'm just so thankful that I've got Linux to use on a daily basis and that I don't have to resort to Windows 10.
Well, neatly combining the themes of Linux and Microsoft, moving into September, there was the news that Microsoft had developed their own version of Linux. And this caused a bit of a stir initially, and then people realised it was just for Microsoft's internal use.
But I still see people referring to it as a distribution, which it is not, because they're not distributing it. Am I being pedantic here, or is my annoyance justified?
Well, if I was to make my own Linux version, it'd be a distribution. If I took Ubuntu, changed the wallpaper, and called it Jesse OS, it would be a distro, even if I didn't give it to anyone.
No, you have to distribute it to be a distribution. The clue is in the name. But anyway, let's not get too bogged down with that.
But distro ends in an O.
I can think of plenty of words that begin with letters for you, sir.
It was a pretty big year for Microsoft, though, in the open source field, and there was a whole bunch of announcements they made. I mean, most recently, there was the open sourcing of Microsoft LiveWriter, which is a bit of blogging software that a lot of people have very fond memories of. And again, I don't want to sort of pitch into our possible predictions because I've got no ideas what you guys are going to come up with. But if you weren't going to touch upon it, do either of you have any thoughts on the possibility of Microsoft actually buying out a Linux vendor this coming year?
Well, I have seen a fair bit of chatter about that, and people around this time of year are always making predictions. And I've seen quite explicit predictions about that. I can't see it personally. I think that they've got enough Linuxy things going on with the cloud. They don't need to buy an existing project or distro. They're not going to buy Canonical. That's just ridiculous. They just don't need to.
No, we'll be touching on their arrangements with Red Hat later on. I was thinking perhaps more along the lines of SUSE.
No, I can't see it, I'm afraid.
Okay, just as well it's not my predictions then, isn't it?
Can I hear you crossing something out there, Paddy?
Go on, moving on. Stick on Microsoft, though.
Well, this was the slightly sad news, and I say sad from a personal point of view because my prediction is being blown out of the water. But this is that Steam gamers were using Windows 10 more to play games than all of the Linux distributions combined. And this was while Windows 10, I think, was still in beta.
No, it was after it was released, but it was shortly after it was released.
Yeah, so rather than the fact that Steam and Valve had embraced Linux by releasing a native application for it, it also sort of promoted its Steam machines, although the actual hardware for them was a bit loose and lost without the controllers, which were to come later in the year. But the fact that all those people who had Steam available to them and the people who, had been saying that Linux isn't a viable option because it doesn't have A-class games and lots of games on it, that wasn't really an argument anymore because Steam was on it. But within a month or two of Windows 10 being available, it just decimated the number of Linux users. So it does kind of preempt my prediction from last year, but that's the way the world turns.
Well, Windows 10 has come along, and we talked briefly about the privacy concerns and how I would be very reluctant to use it. But the average person doesn't care about that stuff and thinks they've got enough control. And if you go into various options and hack the registry, you can stop it calling home and the host file and all that kind of stuff. I think it boils down to Windows 8 came along. People realized, this is terrible. Maybe we should look at other options. And Valve thought that very same thing. Seriously started their backup plan of Steam for Linux and Steam OS. Now Windows 10 has come out and it's done very well. It's back to something close to a proper interface. And suddenly Steam OS and gaming on Linux just seems irrelevant again.
We mentioned earlier that back in February, Crunchband closed the doors, but there were remarkably few projects that seemed to shutter up this year. One of the other notable ones was Lilo, the bootloader, announced in September they'd be ceasing development at the end of the year.
Now, Lilo is one of those things that you see in various distro installers, like Debian, and you see Lilo or Grub. Okay, I know Grub. I'll go with that. So I've never used it. So I can't say I'm going to personally miss it, but at the same time, it is good to have competition. But it's hard to mourn something you've never used.
Yeah, I'm on the same. I've definitely used it once or maybe twice, but not. That was when I wasn't really sure what was going on with things. I just picked various options. But if you were to say to someone, I'm using Grub, they would look at you with exactly the same face as they were using previously, and it would not be a shock to them at all. If you said to someone, oh, I use Lilo as my bootloader, there would be a reaction of, oh, really? Because it is an uncommon thing. It's a rare thing. And I think there's nothing wrong with the way that Grub works. I know you're saying about competition and that sort of thing, but is there really a lot of competition at that level these days? As long as it works and you can run Grub Rescue, is basically done. I do now pause because I heard recently there was some news that there was a way you could crack Grub by pressing backspace a lot, and that therefore had to have an update. But so while there are security updates and things, I think generally the way in which it works, everyone's used to it, and I think Lilo is the much less commonly used bootloader, and so it's not surprising that it's stopped.
Well, moving into October, and on the 4th of October, the Free Software Foundation turned 30. Founded on October the 4th, 1985. And we've often disagreed with, I suppose, the way to say it, some of the things that the Free Software Foundation says and stands for, but I think it is very important and has been very important with the free and open source software world. I don't think that we would be where we are were it not for the FSF. So I think you can forgive some of their slight hypocrisy when it comes to freedom and the all-important fifth freedom. Because, I'm sitting here surrounded by Linux and wouldn't be probably, I don't think, were it not for the FSF. And certainly without Stallman.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with your point that a lot of what we have and a lot of the foundations that we rest on were laid by the FSF and Stallman and his ilk. I wonder how we've got into October without the big news of mentioning that Paddy wasn't on the show for a month, because that has really, rocked the Linux world, I feel.
Yeah, it did rock the FOSS world, didn't it?
Yeah, so let's just remember that time when there was a quiet month without him.
That very dark time. No, it wasn't that bad. We had Andrew from Linux Voice and Pete Cannon came on and helped us out, so very grateful to those guys.
Yeah, I am in particular. It's interesting, though, Joe, you mentioned free and open source there, sort of in the same breath, and saying that we wouldn't be in the position we are without the FSF. And also in October, there was this whole video series from the Linux Foundation, which was gobsmackingly awful, I think, generally accepted view of it. I don't know if you've seen the latest one that came out about a week ago. And it was quite noticeable in that there was a very pointed reference to the FSF in there, where one of the characters in the actual animation says, "Oh, it's good news / Linux." Someone makes me say that, which I found was quite a little dig in there.
Oh, I haven't seen it. Did he say GNU / Linux, or did he say it properly?
No, she said it properly, but she made a comment that she was being forced to say it. And I thought, since that video was obviously authorised and put out specifically by the Linux Foundation, that was a rather unsubtle dig at the FSF.
Mm.
But how do we feel about the series anyway? Do you think it will have converted anyone over to the Linux cause?
Oh, yeah, I'm sure it'll convert people in their droves, yeah.
Isn't it trending on YouTube at the moment?
Is it?
No, of course not.
Oh, right, sorry. a bit thick there. Yeah, I mean, come on. I saw the first one and it was just a bit naff, really, wasn't it? And just wasn't going to do anything. It wasn't even accurate. It was trying to say that without open source software or Linux, you'd have to go to the library to look things up. I think it was the lyrics of something, or when a Michael Jackson song came out, which was just totally ridiculous. And we talked about at the time there'd be some other open source project, or at least some proprietary project, that would have been the cornerstone of the internet. So yeah, all a bit ridiculous, really. And I haven't bothered watching any of the other ones, and I can't see any normal people watching them. But you never know. They might convert one or two people.
Yeah, I don't understand where they're being shown, because if you go to the Linux Foundation website, of course you're going to see them. But then if you're going to the Linux Foundation website, you are already interested in Linux. These should be advertised in like the Super Bowl and, on X Factor and things like this, where people will see them who aren't otherwise going to see them. I don't understand where they're getting shown, apart from to be ripped apart by people who already use Linux who think they're stupid.
Well, I know the Linux Foundation are pretty minted, but come on, they haven't got that much money to be advertising on the Super Bowl. I think the idea was that people would share them on social media and stuff, and I have only seen them shared to, rip them apart, really, not to be serious about it.
And at the end of October, we covered the fact that the Chromebooks were now the most popular classroom computing device in US schools. So they'd reached 51%, if I remember rightly, of the education market, based on two factors, that the hardware and the software. So the hardware is both cheaper than Microsoft's offerings and Apple's offerings, and the software is able to be updated through the whole classroom or the whole suite of PCs and laptops in one go. There's apparently very good Google Education services and applications. You can allow one Chromebook to be shared between multiple students and they can all log on with their own credentials and things. So it really sort of fitted the niche for classroom use, and it's not surprising that they've done very well. Now, it's not quite such a rosy picture across the rest of the globe, but Google is a US company. They are US focused. If you're going to try and get your foot in the door somewhere, you're going to do it on your home turf, is the way I see it.
Well, as I always say, I would rather tax money got spent on a Chromebook than on an iPad or a Windows machine. I know that it's not proper Linux, but I don't know, Google's the lesser of several evils, I think.
But also it's just the cost of the thing. I mean, yeah, you could argue that a Chromebook is, let's pick £200, whereas a equivalent Windows laptop would be $250. You multiply that by 200 devices, that's quite a big difference, but it's not cripplingly so. When Apple products are like twice the price, and there was that news article, I don't know if you read it, about the sort of region or school district in the US which moved to like entirely iPads, and only a year or so later they were defunct or couldn't operate properly or something like that, and they wasted millions of dollars. You just have to think, well, going for a cheap version in what can only be described as one of the most harsh environments for a laptop, in a school where the children don't even own them, it would make sense to go with the cheapest hardware. So I think Apple is out from that point of view solely, and maybe Windows, if they get their act together, can get some cheaper hardware out there to try and compete. So maybe it will be the software that Chromebooks win on.
Well, talking about cheap hardware brings us very nicely into November, and a magazine that an awful lot of people rushed out to buy.
And that was the Magpie magazine, which I still haven't got, and I still haven't got a Pi Zero, even though I'm supposed to be doing a podcast about the Raspberry Pi. I actually bid on one today on eBay. Someone was selling the magazine and the Pi Zero, and they wanted £30 for it, even though it was only £6 for the magazine. So I offered £5. He said 25. I said 6. He said 25. I said £6 and a penny, and he said 25. That's it. So that was it, I'm afraid. So it shows that there is a demand out there, or at least people perceive demand, because there's a lack of supply. And I know that you two criticised it for the ports that it lacks, but the fact is that I've got an OTG cable and I've got a mini HDMI cable, so I could just plug it in and use it instantly. So for me, it would be whatever the cost of the device was and nothing else. So I would still very much like to get one. And I think that if you're looking to embed it within things like Xbox controllers or NES controllers, whatever, it is the perfect Pi to do that. But I can see the arguments of things like chip have got more functionality. But Raspberry Pi is the name you know, so it's going to inevitably do well. And, it's not exactly a spoiler, and not even a valid prediction to say that in 2016, Raspberry Pi is going to go from strength to strength.
Yeah, we've had that debate before, so let's move on to some other news. And also in November, an interview with Linus Torvalds and his discussion on his point of view of security of the Linux kernel, and how the amount of effort that you have to put into Linux security, and whether or not that is actually where the kernel should be putting that effort, or whether it should be, balancing it against usability and functionality and increasing the number of hardware devices that it can support and things like this, did sort of kick up a little bit of a fuss between people, saying that he didn't take security seriously, and therefore Linux wasn't as secure as it could be if it was a higher priority from Linus and the kernel developers. Yeah,
it boils down to whether security bugs are more important than other bugs, and Linus doesn't seem to think so.
No, he thinks security bugs are bugs, full stop. He sees no differentiation between the two. And it kind of goes back to what we're talking about with the social justice warriors, if you like, excuse the phrase. it's a good conversation to have, and sometimes it takes a while for these conversations to come to the surface, but now it's been exposed and given a little bit of sunshine, maybe it will continue, and that would be no bad thing whatsoever. November also saw the announcement of a rather large deal between Red Hat and Microsoft, which appears to encompass all sorts of things, including intellectual property, but we're obviously not being given the full details on it.
Well, it's funny, I was watching a discussion with Brian Lunduke and various other people, including Stallman, over the last week. And as usual, Stallman tried to get his point across about the difference between free software and open source software, and the fact that almost all open source software is free software, but it's very much a philosophical difference, and that open source software is a pragmatic approach. We're going to have open source code so that we get better code as a result of it, and it doesn't matter about the ethics of it and, you know, potentially questionable whatever. And it seems that Microsoft over the last year or so has been embracing open source from this purely pragmatic point of view, and they are partnering up with people like Red Hat, and as we'll get into in December with the Linux Foundation, in fact, with the training there, in order to progress Microsoft as a company and make more money, because they've realized that from a pragmatic point of view, open source is often a better way of doing things, or at least partially using open source software. And listening to Stallman, something clicked in my head that Microsoft don't care at all about free software, but they do care about open source because there's money to be made. And that is just the crux of it, that there's no driving force other than money, which is to be expected. We're talking about big business.
Yeah, you make the point about Microsoft being in open source just for the money, but you'd make exactly the same point, therefore, about Red Hat not wanting to be dealing with free software for the ethical reasons and the hypothetical sort of thought-type reasons that RMS puts forwards, but because it's open source, and therefore they can make money out of it. Like you've pointed out with Microsoft, they are in open source because that's where money is being made. Red Hat have forged that, and Red Hat have been the only people beating that drum, and now it's really paying off because, you know, they've got in bed with one of the biggest software companies out there. So they come at it from the same point of view.
Yeah, to be fair to Red Hat, like a lot of companies, and in fact probably within Microsoft, just because the company is all about the bottom line and doesn't care about ethics and software freedom, I'm sure there are plenty of people working within both organizations who do care about software freedom. But you have to think about the company as a whole, and the management and the shareholders and all that kind of thing. And that is where open source is much more important than free software.
Yeah, absolutely. And oddly enough, we move into December with yet another Microsoft and open source topic. And anyone who's listened to the show recently, this will be fairly fresh in their minds. But it was that Microsoft in December offered a Linux certification, which was backed by the Linux Foundation. So it was released in order that people who were deploying Linux on the Azure cloud were able to both understand how the Azure side with Microsoft worked, as well as the Linux deployment they were releasing. So it's sort of a two-part certification there.
And Paddy, you've put in a link to a Phosphorus article, rather clickbaity, I must say, saying Linux Foundations deal with the devil. And I don't know, again, the Linux Foundation is very much open source rather than free software, isn't it? It's a very pragmatic organization that is pushing the idea that open source software is better than proprietary software. So to me, it's almost like I've had this huge realization of, and it suddenly made sense what Stallman has been saying all this time about this differentiation. And so I'm not at all surprised that the Linux Foundation are partnering up with Microsoft, because, as we said, they're a trade body who is there to promote the use of Linux, the kernel, in whatever shape or form that takes. And partnering up with a huge company like Microsoft will progress Linux, so they're doing their job.
Yeah, absolutely they are. I agree with you entirely. I mean, maybe it's time we had another licensing over a pint or something at some stage, because I'd be interested to see how your point of view has changed somewhat. Because the one thing I don't see from Stallman, and I didn't actually watch the video of the discussion you were talking about, but I did hear it as a podcast. What I didn't hear from Stallman there, and what I rarely hear articulated, are the actual fundamental goals and why free, in air quotes, because we know that GNU software, GPL software isn't free. What it's trying to achieve that open source doesn't achieve better. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now. So let's carry on with another story from December, which again will be familiar to recent listeners. And that was another Linux Foundation one, with the release of Let's Encrypt, going from private beta into public beta. And an enormous number of certificates have been issued so far. I mean, when we spoke about it on the show last, which was a week ago, 2 weeks ago, it was up to about 100,000. It now looks to be about 200,000 a fortnight or so later.
Well, there's no doubt that this is popular, and it's no surprise that it was guaranteed to be popular. An easy-to-install free certificate. Who could say no? Apart from the most paranoid tinfoil hat people who don't want to run binaries on their server like me. Now, I know there are alternatives, and if you do some work, then you don't need to give root access to anything, and you can do it more of the old-fashioned way. I know I got into trouble for saying that last time, but you can install it manually and get a free certificate. So it's no surprise, really, and it's something that I really ought to get round to, I suppose. But then again, what is the benefit for my site? There's a few blog posts and a podcast that I occasionally do that hardly anyone listens to. Is it really worth my time to make it HTTPS? I mean, do the government really care that you're listening to me? Probably not.
And just for the benefit of John the Nice Guy Spriggs, that email address is joe@linuxluddites.com.
Well, what can I say? I'm just too lazy to do it, but I probably will at some point next year. In fact, no, that's my prediction. I won't get round to it next year. But that linuxluddites.com will probably, by this time next year, have a Let's Encrypt certificate.
Yeah, I suspect you're right. We get our certificates at the moment from a free CA, and that certainly isn't going to change in the future. So no matter what I think about the infrastructure, and that's not a rabbit warren we're going down right now, I'm sure it will be Let's Encrypt next year. Moving it on then, got a couple of stories that we've not actually covered previously on the show because, strangely enough, a few things have happened in December. And the first of these is that AMD appears to be making a big pitch into the open source world for their GPU drivers. I know nothing about Linux gaming. I mean, what is the impact of this? I mean, how important an announcement is it?
I think that going forwards with the newer AMD GPUs, it's important in that we're going to have more open source software, although I think that, again, it's a pragmatic approach of most of the open source drivers that will facilitate the loading of proprietary binaries to make them work for things like gaming and indeed for high performance computing, where you're clustering various GPUs together and stuff like that. I think things like my old Vio with the ATI card that needs a binary to run, they're not going to go back and do any of that stuff. But I think it's trying to compete with NVIDIA.
Yeah, my understanding was it's sort of an open source core that can be common across platforms, and then you will have the binary bits for the high performance stuff around the edges that will be proprietary still. Is that right?
I think so. And I think that for the average user who just wants to watch YouTube videos and very light gaming, it's probably good news because they'll be able to run better open source drivers. But anyone who's into gaming or trying to mine Bitcoin and stuff like that, well, not Bitcoin because that's hopeless, but, cryptocurrencies, it's still going to be the same situation, having to run proprietary binary blobs. But for those of us who aren't doing that stuff, I think it is broadly good news. Well, before we talk any more about stuff that we haven't got a clue about, let's quickly move on to the first ever website that was 25 years ago. And website is a bit of a polite term, I suppose, for a page with a few links on it and some sort of title. Of course, 25 years ago, Tim Berners-Lee, now Sir Tim Berners-Lee, formed the World Wide Web, and the first ever website is really boring. I was hoping it'd have a cool picture of a cat or something, but unfortunately it's just loads of info about what the World Wide Web is and how it's going to work, and loads of links out to various other pages. But it's amazing that we've gone in 25 years, which, if you're young, is quite a long time, but when you start cracking on a bit like us,
Yeah.
you realise that we've gone from that page where he didn't even specify a background colour to all of the web apps and HTML5 and JavaScript stuff in 25 years. It makes you wonder what's going to happen in another 25 years.
Yeah, and you've got to remember it wasn't even really 25 years. I mean, that's the anniversary we're looking at here, but the web came into common parlance and people became aware of the internet, which obviously the World Wide Web was their view of the internet at the time, largely in 1995, which was only 20 years ago, with Windows 95 being the first common, widely used operating system with access to it, and that was the year that Netscape Navigator sort of really started cranking up and all the rest of it. So it's amazing how much has changed in the last 20 years, to be honest.
Well, one of the major things that's happened is censorship. And there was a time when the web and the internet was totally free and anyone could do anything they wanted on it. Whereas now we've got to a situation where I personally cannot go to the Pirate Bay's site or various other torrent sites and loads of other sites, in fact, without being blocked by my ISP, Virgin Media. And there was a proposal to add an HTTP error code 451 to display that it was censored, the page you were looking at. And that has actually finally happened now. So we are going to see 451 status codes, error codes, potentially, if people actually admit that what you're trying to look at is censored.
Yeah, I know the sites you mean that are blocked by the UK ISPs at the moment, so Pirate Bay and some other torrenting and some gambling sites. But I do wonder whether or not, those are quite sort of above board, clear reasons as to why they've been blocked. And therefore, I think, the government would be happy to say, or the ISPs would be happy to say, this is a 451 error. This is because it's been blocked by the government. You don't get to look at it. But as soon as the government blocks something that they don't want you to know they're blocking, I doubt there's going to be a 451 page, is there?
What sort of sites are you talking about there, Jesse?
Well, I mean, not sites specifically, but let's say there's... I would like to say it's difficult to imagine it in the UK, but given that I've just reeled off some sites that they do already ban, you can see it going further. But let's say there were governments who didn't agree with homosexuality or didn't agree with certain religions or what have you, and they could justifiably ban them and say this is being banned for censorship reasons. But I think it's far more likely that when it comes to government and political type blacking out of websites, they're just going to be blacked out. They're not going to put a big thing on it that says, we've banned this, sorry, you're not allowed to look at it because you're from our country, or we've told our ISPs to stop people looking at it. The firewall of China and things like this. There are loads of sites that people can't look at from different countries, the UK, the US included, but I don't know how happily they will advertise it. When it comes to porn, gambling, and downloading of illegal stuff, they sit on the sort of righteous side, as it were. But if it comes to IS, for example, would they block websites that the IS or whatever they're called at the moment would have put up and advertise that, or would they just not let you see them and it'd be a blackout?
Well, I guess it will be interesting to watch which sites actually do get flagged up as a 451, and I'm sure everyone can work out the literary reference there. Shall we move on then and talk about our predictions from last year?
Yeah, let's do it. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. It's that time of year again when we look back at our 2015 predictions. And if you'd like to hear what we actually said, then you can go back to episode 32, and from about 1 hour, 18 minutes onwards, we gave them. So let's start with Jesse's first one. Elementary OS will be the golden boy of 2015. It'll be so good, I'll switch to it, and Joe will hate it because it's so popular. Well, fast forward to episode 43, and we reviewed it, and it was basically positive, and all three of us are currently running it. So a win for you, Jesse. Well done.
Do you hate it, Joe?
I don't hate it because it's popular. I hate it because it's rubbish.
Oh, bloody hell. I haven't even won that part of it. So I agree that I think the end of 2014, beginning of 2015 was very rosy for Elementary OS. And I think that even the backlash they had about the way they wanted it to be funded did show the number of people that felt passionately about it and the number of people who wanted to discuss it because it was sort of the moment. But they do have a very, very long burn between releases, and it's almost too long for it to be kept in the mind. And I do see a lot of stuff on Google Plus and that about Elementary OS and the work they're doing and people finding it very popular. And I did a bit of research to try and justify my Golden Boy of 2015. And it was in all of the top 10 distros of 2015, or when you install Linux, these are your options, or, Linux for newbies and stuff like this. It was in all of those. But in all of them, it was about 7 or 8 in the list. Ubuntu always came higher. Linux Mint always came higher. Things like SUSE and Fedora all came higher. And it was just in this is particularly nice to look at. So I agree that it has not been the golden boy I thought it would be, and I am not running it, and the world is not running it, and so Joe doesn't hate it. So it didn't quite come true. So
a fail, basically, is what you're admitting.
I'll accept fail.
Okay, well, Paddy's first one was that people will eat breakfast in the morning in 2015. No, sorry, Windows 10 will be a huge success. Surprise, surprise, surprise. It was a huge success, and that was a very, very cop-out prediction, Paddy. Come on.
Yeah, I think generally my predictions were fairly feeble last year, to be honest. I'm trying to work on a few more measurable ones this time around and not so obvious. But yeah, I mean, it has been a huge success, and I've run it on the machines I have to run Windows on quite happily. I must admit I've gone back to Windows 7 on one of the boxes. But yeah, it has been a big success, and even though adoption slowed slightly now, it's certainly helping Microsoft recover from the debacle that was Windows 8.
Yeah, no surprises there.
So we'll move on to your first prediction from last year, Joe, which is kind of a familiar one to listeners of the show for the last couple of years, and that was an Ubuntu phone or tablet will come out and get almost universally terrible reviews.
Well, the first part of it is definitely true. An Ubuntu phone came out. In fact, a couple of Ubuntu phones came out. The second part of it, I don't know. We talked briefly about the Aquarius E 4.5 on episode 35, and I gave it a pretty poor review. But what is the consensus? I had a quick look around a couple of nights ago for reviews of it, and they were all very diplomatic, I think. They were all saying that it had some good points, but there were always caveats in those reviews. It was almost like they were treating it not as a consumer product. They were giving it the excuse of it's new, it's open source, whatever. But I think reading between the lines of those reviews, they were all fairly terrible, and therefore it is 100% win for me.
Yeah, I think people that I know who use an Ubuntu phone, or I've heard on podcasts and bits and bobs, I get the impression they all carry two phones. It is not a single device that does everything they want. All people who have an Ubuntu phone, pretty much all, now I think about it, someone at OddCamp I was chatting to genuinely use only an Ubuntu phone. But pretty much most people have it as a second phone, and that is a bad review in itself.
Well, even Popey, who's the community manager for Ubuntu, whose main job it is, as far as I can see, is to promote Ubuntu phone and apps on it and stuff. I saw him in the pub the other night, and what did he have with him? Is OnePlus X running Android. So I'm afraid that's case closed.
Well, speaking about Popey, we did on the show discuss the fact that on another podcast, if that doesn't get too complicated to follow, he made the prediction or at least highlighted the idea that Ubuntu would go rolling in 2015 and that potentially Amazon would buy Canonical. And I think we discussed the fact that they both sounded fairly unlikely given Martin Wimpress's belief in the way that Ubuntu is made and how it would jar badly to move to rolling. And also, I think we just didn't think that Amazon would be that interested in the money-lossing machine that is Canonical.
Making up words again, money-lossing.
Yeah, I did think about that.
But yeah, you're right. They just neither of those things have come true, and it just doesn't look likely anytime soon, does it? It's not going to go rolling, and Amazon, well, certainly not publicly. They haven't shown any signs of wanting to approach Canonical, but you never know. Maybe in 2016, but I doubt it somehow.
Oh, I'm looking forward to a January announcement from Amazon now. So Paddy's second prediction was that Docker and Hadoop would continue to be flavour of the month, and some Docker functionality would be rolled in lower down the stack. So state your case, Paddy.
Yeah, it's another yawner of a prediction, wasn't it? Yes, Docker and Hadoop have continued to be flavour of the month, particularly Docker, and there has been some movement lower down the stack. But I mean, it was a cop-out prediction, like my first one was. To be honest, it's so blatant. I mean, there is a huge push still in the container space. It's something new and shiny to sell to people. There's a few use cases. People are slowly waking up to the fact that security isn't terribly clever in that environment, and how you update stuff and how you actually get hold of validated, verifiable stuff in the first place to put in your container is also a huge problem. But yeah, it's going to carry on because it's all part of this cloudification that the world is pushing towards.
Okay, well, pretty safe prediction there coming true. Surprise, surprise. So Jesse's next one was Ubuntu to release a new software center to tie in with Click packages. So close, Jesse. So close is all I can say.
It is unbelievably close. This isn't fair. I'm not classing this as close. I'm classing this as a win.
No way. They might have announced it, but no, we're getting to the end of 2015 and it has not happened. So this is a definite fail. You can't do a me and spin this into a win, I'm afraid.
So this is the only one I've got that's remotely close to a win. So I'm reading off of OMG Ubuntu, and they have a quote from a lovely chap at Canonical HQ, and this is about the fact that they are going to move from the Ubuntu Software Center to the GNOME Software Center, which is called which in fact is called the GNOME Software Center. I was correct. So the quote is, "We are more confident in our ability to add support for snaps to GNOME Software Center than we are to Ubuntu Software Center," and it goes on. So they are moving to a different software center in order to add support for snaps. That's a win.
Moving, going to happen. I'll give you a kind of half win on that. Okay, fair enough.
All right, I'll accept a 50% win. I'll clock that up and tell my mum at Christmas that I got halfway there.
Well, I think it's becoming increasingly apparent he needs all the points he can get. And
Yeah.
The next one kind of rams that one home as well. Joe, you said we won't see a stable and working release of Dev 1 this year. And Jesse's retort to that was, at some point in 2015, one of the non-System D derivatives will hit the top 20 on DistroWatch.
Okay, let's address the first part of that. And if you go to the download zone of Dev 1, there are various images available. In fact, for things like the Banana Pi and the Big Bone Black, and indeed for just standard x86 machines. And we talked about my projector, what feels like years ago in our news wrap-up. And I installed it on that, and I'm afraid it worked as well as Debian does. Although there was still some System D stuff in there. So it feels as if they haven't really done what they set out to do in the first place. But there is a release candidate, albeit a net installer, which will install Dev 1 and give you a working distro. And interestingly, their Dev 1 desktop environment in the software section I thought, yeah, I'll go for the default, expecting GNOME, but what pops up but XFCE? So it's actually got a really sensible desktop as well. So that is a bit of a fail. Okay, that is a lot of a fail. I totally got that wrong. Dev1 did release something, even though it's not an official stable release, it is a working release. So there we go. But let's deflect that negativity back onto Jesse.
Yes, you were good enough to nobly take that until you just threw it back in my face.
Threw you on the bus, yeah.
I accept. So my retort, and in fact my prediction, and hence why these have been paired together, is that one of the non-system D derivatives will hit the top 20 in DistroWatch. I have struggled to find a non-Dev1 non-system D derivative. So basically all my searching, and I remember there was like a flurry of them at the end of last year, and not one of them seems to have survived more than about 2 months, and there's no record of them. So basically I'm down to Dev1 as the only non-system D, non-Debian derivative. And I looked on DistroWatch, and it isn't even listed on DistroWatch. So for it to become a top 20 is an impossibility. It's on their watch list. That's all it is. And so I will accept a full 0 on that one.
So Paddy's next one, again, what were you doing last year, Paddy? You really phoned this in. Drones or quadcopters will become ubiquitous in 2015. Well, my father-in-law is getting one for Christmas, so that pretty much answers that.
Well, I was right then, wasn't I?
Well, yeah, exactly. That was a very easy thing to predict, wasn't it? But I said during the conversation that I didn't think that Amazon would be delivering stuff with drones just yet. And that has not happened, despite this advert link that you put in with Clarkson.
It hasn't happened yet, but it's well on the way, I think. If you look at what they're doing now with the fixed-wing stuff, Amazon, I can see it happening this coming year.
I'm very sceptical, I must say.
Well, I'm keeping my Prime subscription then, because if there's anything I know, it's that getting stuff delivered by drone is the first thing I'm going to do.
What, just so you can capture it?
Yeah, just so I can. I mean, the fact that I could get something delivered within like a couple of hours the other day was absolutely fantastic.
Drones, just one other thought on drones. Something that just says about the state of the world, I think, well, the state of America. I don't know if you noticed, but starting from this coming year, if you own a drone in the States, you're going to have to register it with the FAA. It's only going to cost $5, but if you don't, then you're going to be in big trouble. But of course, it's not necessary to register guns over there still. In fact, it's illegal to force you to register guns at the national level. States can do it, put in their own laws, but nationally you can't.
Does that apply to little tiny handheld quadcopters, or is it only ones that are autonomous?
Yeah, this is the difference between a drone and a quadcopter versus, I mean, what's the difference between the current set of helicopters, which people have been flying for years? It must have something to do with its ability to know where it is in space itself, and therefore be automatically flying somewhere or automatically hold a position or something. Because if you do it on size, then everyone will start releasing drones smaller than the cutoff size.
Well, let's not try and understand American law. It's hard enough to understand UK law, and Americans are a bit more complicated. So let's move on to my next major win. Oh no, I'm afraid it is a fail. And I said that no major backported software will make it into Mint 17.x. And I said that Mint-specific stuff would be updated, but no major desktop apps or software. There's just one word, LibreOffice 5 point whatever is now in 17.3, so that was just totally wrong, I'm afraid.
Well, let's carry on that batting average and move it over to Jesse, whose Steam bet, which we talked about slightly earlier in the show, was that the top 10 grossing games of 2015 in the Steam store will be available on Linux. And we did press him on this at the time because it was a little bit ambiguous as to whether he was talking about native ones or ones running under Wine or what have you. And you did qualify, Jesse, that they may not necessarily be native apps. They could be sort of dodgy Windows apps just packaged up to run under Linux. But how are we doing? Are the top 10 grossing Linux games in the Steam store available on Linux?
Thankfully, Jesse did loads of research today and wrote a really interesting document with loads of numbers and then brought it home with him. No, sorry, you left it at work, Jesse.
Yeah, so the Christmas time at work is not so busy, so I'm able to do some research for the show. And I thought I would get some numbers down as to just how many Linux games there are and how not only the top 10 but the top 20 are all available. And unfortunately I left it all at work. But the summary is this, is that Steam do not release the revenue from the games they're selling because they feel it would undermine the various distributors and the people who are working on it. So they don't give you numbers of games, therefore you can't work out who the biggest revenue maker is. However, there is a website called the Game Spy, or Steam Spy I think it is, who sort of analyses the various downloads and things, and therefore works out what the most popular game is being downloaded and things like this. So I ordered their list by the number of users of the games. Of the top 20, only 5 were paid for. So that's not surprising because people will download free games, of course they will. But I basically found GTA 5, Fallout 4, Ark, Survival Evolved, H1Z1, Rocket League, Cities, and some other games, which are paid for and in the top 20 games of 2015. So they're basically the most paid for. And if they're the most played, they must be the most revenue producing ones, is the way I worked it out. Basically, GTA 5 is not on Linux, Fallout 4 is not on Linux, H1Z1 is not on Linux, Rocket League is not on Linux, Ark, Survival Evolved is, and Cities, Skylines and Prison Architect is. And there's only 7 games, but it kind of made the point that of that list, if you'd read them out to me, I would know GTA 5 and Fallout 4, and the other 5 I've never heard of. I then went through, there was a website which showed the upcoming games for 2016 in Steam, and looking through those, they were the big A-list games like Metal Gear Solid and Final Fantasy and the Punch 'em Up, Super Street Fighter and things like this. The ones that you would know as A-rated games, Medal of Honor, Tom Clancy's Rainbow, whatever it is, none of them are available on Linux. So not only did I fail this year, but I have predicted a failure if I was to repeat it next year. So I am steering clear of Steam games in my predictions.
Okay, well, Paddy's next one was Nuzzle will become a very large social media thing this year.
Yeah, so a crumb of comfort there for Jesse, because it didn't at all. I mean, they still exist. You hadn't heard of them last year when I mentioned them. Nobody's heard of them still. They are plugging away. They've got some more funding. But generally with these sort of endeavours, if they don't make an impact fairly rapidly, they'll just carry on burning through funding for a couple of years and then die a miserable death. So, nope, I screwed that one.
What was that one? About this time last year, there was a new one that had come out, and it was very black and white, sort of almost... Elo. Yeah. What happened to that?
Still going, I think, isn't it?
Is it?
Just.
Yeah, that's the thing. You're right. If they don't make an instant impact, then they're just doomed, aren't they? They're doomed to obscurity indefinitely.
So I'm glad that one of Paddy's predictions was a little bit more racy and didn't come true rather than his fairly tried and tested ones. But Joe's next prediction was that there will be another Heartbleed or Shellshock level bug in an old and widely used piece of free open source software, and it'll be given a catchy name.
Well, let's just say Android has been around for years and is definitely open source software. Therefore, Stage Fright is a 100% win for me.
No. Well, you can make your case if you wish, but you were talking about something like Heartbleed or Shellshock.
Yeah.
At that sort of level, and I don't think Stage Fright qualifies. But
it did have a catchy name, though.
It did, and a funky logo. I mean, it had all the marketing right, didn't it, as these bugs tend to these days. But I mean, do you think it's going to go down the number of these that we see because of the amount of money now being pumped into some of the basic software that we use?
Well, you'd hope so with things like the Core Infrastructure Initiative. I mean, that's what they're there to do. So hopefully we will see fewer of these massive cases that make the mainstream news. And I suppose I'm actually glad that I got this one wrong, that we didn't have anything in the order of Shellshock or Heartbleed, did we?
Yeah, last year, 2014 last year, was a big double whammy on the open source community for having these two massive issues. And it did highlight, however, how widely open source is used or free software is used in, all the servers and things. But I wonder, because you've talked about the core infrastructure initiative, and it is sensible to give people money to continue developing things which are used. Of course, Heartbleed and Shell Shock are very good examples of where the money should be going. But I do wonder, without some sort of test mechanism, without a hammer to beat against those security protocols and try and test them, are you not just pouring money into people bringing stuff up to speed just to keep up with whatever is new in technology, not necessarily like actually getting physical evidence, or maybe not physical evidence, but evidence that you are improving it on a security point of view? If you're not trialing it, how are you going to know if your money's going anywhere? And I wonder where the core infrastructure initiative actually needs to put some money into sort of test beds and software and ways of rattling the cage a little bit.
Auditing is what you're talking about, really.
Yes, thank you. That's what I mean.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Jesse, but if you cast your mind back to, I think it was episode 51, we were talking about the Linux Foundation's proposals for the open source best practices badging system that David A. Wheeler was part of.
I am casting my mind back, and that does ring a bell. You had to do a number of things in order to tick the various boxes, and then once those boxes were ticked, you were given a badge of approval to show that you were able to update things in a quick time and to make sure that you had tested it against a number of basic security requirements.
Yeah, it was more about project management and making sure things were done in a correct manner and responded to in a correct manner as well, rather than the actual banging on stuff and trying to break it that you were referring to. But it is part of the same core infrastructure initiative, so they are attacking it from a few different directions.
Well, it sounds like they've got some clever people at the helm.
Okay, well, let's finish up with Jesse's last prediction that there'll be a major leak of user data from a social network. And you said that you meant 10 million records plus from one of the big players. And I disagreed at the time and said that Facebook, Twitter, Google+, and Instagram won't have a major leak, but some of the smaller ones might, but definitely those big established four won't. And to my knowledge, I was right and you were wrong.
Yeah, okay, so the words as they're written, I agree, haven't come out. However,
have you ever considered a career in politics, Jesse?
Have you seen the guy with the flood defences from the Environment Agency? And he's saying, the flood defences worked, it's just that the water came over the top of them. It's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant. But in doing my research, I agree. My hands are up. The big 5 or 6 did not get crippled. They have not had any kind of major leaks. Agreed. In doing my research, however, I did find various kind of websites that showed how many leaks or extractions or breaches of security there were. And, a lot of them are quite big American companies. JP Morgan Chase, 76 million bits of information came out of there. I don't know whether these are email addresses or personal information. There's a great sort of blob diagram that shows the number of things that were leaked or taken out. Target, 70 million. Anthem, which I believe is sort of a health kind of website, 80 million. Home Depot, 56 million. eBay, 145 million. Everyone got that email telling them to change their password. And you can go on and on. Evernote, 50 million. Blizzard, 14 million. Living Social, 50 million. AOL, 2.5 million. And what I realised from this was that actually, while I was wrong, of course, setting my target at 10 million was incredibly low. I should have been talking about 100 million or 500 million. It's the scale of the data that these companies hold. And when you talk about big companies like eBay, or you move into the social networks, the sheer scale of information they have on everyone, if it was to get out into the wild, would just be frightening, I think.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right, because it'd be particularly newsworthy if someone like Facebook or Twitter got hacked and all the user data was dumped. But it's far more insidious what's going on at the moment, where there's a whole bunch of companies on a daily basis almost. Little companies being hacked, the data's getting out there, but it's getting aggregated, so complete profiles of individual people are being built up with information coming from various sources, as opposed to it all coming from Facebook hacks, say.
Yeah, I see what you mean. If every time you get a credit card leak, for example, you get it with an email address, and the next time it's with an actual address, the next time it's with a birth date, the next time, before you know it, you've got all the information all linking back to one credit card, and you can use that as your pivot point sort of thing.
So we've gone on almost long enough, but let's briefly talk about the things that we didn't see coming. And I can't believe it. The biggest tech story of the year, I thought I had predicted, but it turns out that was a prediction for 2014 and not 15. And that was the BlackBerry Priv. Finally, an Android phone with a QWERTY slider came out, and I didn't predict it. And I really want one, but they're so expensive. So I don't know, shall I predict one for next year? Well, I'll have to decide by the next time we record. But flippant stories aside, was there anything major that we didn't see coming?
I think actually picking individual items, I mean, we've just gone through the year, and picking one out, you might say this was unusual, that was unusual, but I think the trend is what is the most surprising thing for me, and particularly Microsoft's trend. Now, I know we've discussed this on previous shows, and small pockets of Microsoft are probably quite pro open source and Linux, and then other pockets are far more less pro open source and Linux, and yeah, you'll get both sides of the coin. But just the fact that you're able to say things like Microsoft has a Linux certificate, and Microsoft has got their own in-house Linux, and Microsoft is supporting Red Hat and Debian on their Azure platform, and all these sorts of things, you wouldn't have thought about it 2 or 3 years ago. And I just think it shows just how commonplace and how universal Linux is. I mean, I know we've always said it when it comes to servers and things like this, but the fact that even Microsoft is having to accept that to be a competitor in the market of servers and of cloud and all these sorts of things, you have to have Linux. And that, I think, for me, has always surprised me when we look at the news stories. And Microsoft has been, in small pockets, I agree, but still has been very pro kind of Linux, quite pro open source.
Well, I was asked to write 100 words predicting what would happen in 2016 by Nick from System AU, who's got some crazy idea about putting on an audio tape or something. I don't know quite what he's doing there. But my 100 words can be pretty much summed up by 3 words: nothing will change. And I feel that nothing really changed this year, did it? We talked a lot about trying to make communication more private, but it was all talk and not really much of any consequence happened. And screen resolutions keep getting higher, and clock speeds and numbers of cores keep getting higher, and Linux keeps dominating everything from top to bottom, supercomputers all the way down to routers and stuff. And Apple keep making billions of dollars producing the same thing, slightly rebadged. And 2015 just feels much for muchness, really. Nothing hugely changed. And without getting too far into predictions for 2016, I get the feeling it's going to be the same thing again. People often like to use that buzzword disruptive, and I just don't feel anything has been truly disruptive this year. At the top of every single show we've ever done, I have said that we try the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. And our tagline is "Not all change is progress." Well, despite all of that, this year we decided to change to a weekly format where we would split the show in half and do one show of news and then a second show of sometimes news, sometimes features. And what can we say? Didn't really work out like we hoped. And so we're changing back. We are deciding that we like the old stuff better. And so we're going to go back to releasing every 2 weeks. And we're hoping that it's going to be better as a result, the show, because it's going to be more varied rather than just a whole show that is more or less nothing but news and a bit of opinion in the over a pint. It's going to have distro reviews, it's going to have interviews, it's going to have off the beaten path, and we're going to kind of mix it all up like we used to, basically. And we're hoping that it will work out for the better for a number of reasons. And one of them is the feedback situation. Jesse, you've taken over the feedback recently, and sometimes it can be that people will write in and then it'll be a few weeks before they get their feedback read out. Whereas now we'll be doing it every 2 weeks and releasing it a few days later. And so their feedback will be much more timely, hopefully.
Yeah, and so, for example, we might have a lot of feedback on one particular item we cover and not a lot on another one. It means that we can then balance the other items that we have within that fortnight's podcast and make sure that we get it to a sensible length.
Yeah, and we're hoping that a return back to the old style format where there was genuinely a magazine feel to what we put out there and there was something for everyone in every single episode.
Yeah, and we're going to pretty much split the difference time-wise. There was a time when we were kind of 2 hours plus, which we felt was too long, and we split into 2 1 hours. Now we're going to be aiming for about 90 minutes, hopefully. And to give me a little bit of extra time to get it ready, instead of releasing on a Sunday evening, we're going to be releasing on a Monday mid-morning, afternoon-ish time, depending on what Paddy's got on. So there'll be a slight change there, but hopefully not too much.
I'm not sure I know when all the podcasts come out. I just know they come out into my feed, so hopefully it won't affect too many people.
And I was talking to someone who said that they wouldn't even notice because they just, whenever it comes in their feed, they just download it and listen to it. So hopefully it's not going to affect too many people, but I think the show will be better as a result of it. So the next show is going to be released on the 11th of January, so there's going to be a week off pretty much. But we did give you a massive bumper show, to be fair, to be getting on with in the next couple of weeks. But with that, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com or find us on Twitter or the Google Plus and Facebook communities or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again in 2 weeks for more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, 2015.
See you later.